This is video number 5 in a series on the FORCE strategy. FORCE is an acronym standing for Focus, Organize, Rehearse, Communicate, and Evaluate. These are 5 steps that I use to interact with the target language community and build my proficiency in new languages. So I've talked about the first 4 stages, and now we're going to talk about the stage called Evaluate. After you've finished working through the other stages, then you need to take a moment to examine how it went and to assess your progress and to make plans for where you're going to go in the future. It's important to do this right away, right after you've used your new language to communicate, while everything is still fresh in your mind and your enthusiasm is still real strong. You're probably still really enjoying the excitement of using your new language. Last night my wife and I went to see a movie, and the person who sold us the tickets for the movie spoke to me in Portuguese, and that was really fun. And afterwards, that's a great time to assess how that communication event went and what I might do next, and maybe some new vocabulary that I would use for buying movie tickets in Brazilian Portuguese. Evaluation should be done with a paper and a pen, not just in your head. And you should ask yourself a series of questions, and let me give you a list. You might want to grab a pen and paper and record these yourself. One of the questions that you want to ask yourself is, was your focus specific enough or broad enough, and how could it have been better? For example, if it's too broad, then there was no focus to it. It's very difficult to figure out what exactly you were trying to learn or trying to practice in your new language. And if it's too focused, then you may not be able to use enough of the language or be flexible enough to adapt to what happens in your communication event. Second question you might ask yourself is, was my speaking partner a good one to talk with, and was the location for our conversation suitable? You want to have people who can interact with you well. It's helpful to find people who are able to speak in their own language with foreigners, and not everybody can do that. So that's great if you can find that. Ask yourself if the communication phase of this cycle was too long or too short. If you feel exhausted afterwards, it was too long. Or if your conversation partner looks exhausted or falls asleep or glazes over, then you know it was maybe a little bit too long. If it was too short, then you didn't take advantage of the opportunity as much as you could have, and you could have got more value from it. Were the words and phrases that you prepared for your cycle appropriate and sufficient? Is the organization phase of your FORCE cycle adequate? Did you have the materials that you needed? Were there any learning resources that would help you prepare your organization phase much better? For example, I love these vocabulary books that are organized by themes, and you can look up, for example, medical terminology in French, and that saves you a lot of work. If you don't have one of those and you're preparing a FORCE cycle, you might want to run out to the bookstore and grab one of these thematic word lists, and it'll do half of the work for you. Are there any, or next question, were you understood completely, partly, or just a little bit, and what were the difficulties? Did the other person, the person you were talking to, have any difficulty understanding you? Did you get the main idea across? Did you communicate fairly well, or did it go really quite easily? Those are good ways to evaluate your FORCE cycle. Did you rehearse enough? When you got to the point where you could use your language in actual conversation, were you actually prepared? Did the pieces of language that you had prepared roll off your tongue relatively well? Did you have the vocabulary that you needed? Did the words come out fairly easily? Did you anticipate the responses of the other person? It's all great to prepare what you're going to say, but you also have to have some idea of what the other person might say and the questions that they might ask. For example, if you start speaking Portuguese with somebody, they might ask you, oh, where did you learn your Portuguese? Or are you studying Portuguese? Or did you live in Brazil? Or did you live in Portugal? You can anticipate the questions that you'll probably be asked, and that will help you prepare to respond intelligently and fairly quickly and fairly fluently, and that will keep your communication stage going. Did you understand what was said to you, and how much did you understand? Did you catch the main idea? Did you have to guess a lot, or did you understand most of what was being said? Was your the limitations on your vocabulary a major obstacle? Did you get stuck halfway through sentences? I hate that feeling of starting a sentence and then halfway through discovering I can't finish it and there's just no way out of it. So I try to maybe over prepare sometimes and be sure that I have the words that I'm going to need and not get surprised by a lack of vocabulary. I would say that the most common comment that I get as a language speaker after I've talked with somebody, when I'm speaking fairly well, they often say, you speak this language really well, you just need more vocabulary. That's a really helpful bit of feedback because that's their impression of how I speak their language. They're saying, you know how the language works, you've got the structures figured out, your pronunciation is fine. It would just go more easily if you had more vocabulary. So I think that's really useful. That tells me a lot about what I need to focus on in several of my languages. And I think you'll find that's true for yourself too. Mastering basic language patterns is not that difficult, but collecting large amounts of vocabulary is super important to communicating well and to giving the person that you're talking with the impression that you speak their language. If your grammar's a little off, people still think you speak their language fairly well. If you're lacking vocabulary and they're having trouble conveying information back and forth, then they think you don't speak their language very well. Vocabulary is just huge. You might want to ask yourself if you were confused by unfamiliar language patterns, grammatical patterns that didn't make sense to you, and that even if you understood the words, perhaps you didn't understand what the point was of the things that were said to you and that you were trying to decipher. Ask yourself if you had difficulty distinguishing words or sounds that the other person was saying. Sometimes there are words that sound similar, and the accent on the word or the length of the vowel will change the word entirely. Or a little ending on something is quite important, conveys a lot of information. Were you able to figure that out? This is a good part of your evaluation stage. Ask yourself if the cycle that you did was suitable to your proficiency level. If you're at a low level of proficiency, then you should be doing certain kinds of conversations that are simpler in terms of their themes and vocabulary and language structures. But if you're fairly advanced, you should be able to argue an opinion, talk about politics, talk about conditional statements, things like, if this were true, then I would do that, that sort of thing. Those more advanced communication events are very difficult if you're at a low level of proficiency, and you want to work at the appropriate level. Ask yourself if you exchange real information without using English. You should go out of your way to try to avoid using English, and as much as possible, let the other person speak to you in the target language without trying to explain things to you in English. Way better to wrestle with it and do a little bit of hard work, and the payoff is much better. The results will be better. You'll learn more language if you can stay in the target language as much as possible. Now, don't make it a hard and fast rule. If you have to dip into English a little bit, or if the other person explains something to you in English, that's all right. But switch back and stay in the target language as much as you can. That really helps. Ask yourself if you managed misunderstandings effectively. You will have misunderstandings for sure, so you need to have strategies for dealing with that. And some of the ones that I've discussed before are clarification, repetition, confirmation, paraphrasing, and guessing. Do all of those things before you get to using English. Clarification, you ask, did you say this, or I understood that. Is that what you were meaning? Repetition, oh, could you say that again, please? Confirmation, oh, so it's going to be $24 for my movie tickets. Okay. Paraphrasing, say it in another way. Use different words. Don't simply repeat it, but say it in a different way, and see if that clarifies things. Or ask the person that you're speaking with to say it in a different way. And guessing is wonderful. You always will be guessing to some degree, and I think that really the truth is, even when we're speaking our own languages, we guess. We hear some words and we understand, in our own language, we understand everything, and we hear almost everything, but we fill in the gaps. We say incomplete sentences, and we assume the other person is going to know what we didn't say that should be understood. This will happen a little more often when your proficiency level is low and you hear some words and some expressions that are very familiar, and you have to assume that you got the idea and guess at what the rest was. Usually that works fine, and the further along you go, the more that works. But guessing, don't rule it out. It's not wrong to guess. You'll get caught sometimes guessing wrong, but don't rule it out. Ask yourself if your speaking coach or the person that you were talking with could suggest how you could communicate better, and invite some feedback. As I said, I love the feedback that I got from other people who said, your language is great. It would be easier for us to talk if you had more vocabulary. So then I knew what I really need to work on. I also knew that my grammar and my word order and my pronunciation were made conversation really quite easy. The only barrier was that sometimes I had to talk in a roundabout way and say things maybe in an unnatural way to account for words and expressions that I didn't know. And so I know what to focus on. So that feedback from native speakers was super helpful. If you make a mistake, can you fix that in your next cycle? So for example, if you went to a Chinese restaurant and you ordered your food and you asked how much it was and they told you where the bathroom was, then you know that probably the way that you ask for how much something is, you didn't have that right. So prepare and go back and try to find out how much the bill is supposed to be in Chinese, and see if you get directions to the bathroom again. And that will tell you whether you got that, if you've repaired that problem in your Chinese, and if you've made progress in terms of your pronunciation or your vocabulary or the way that you worded your question. You want to be sure and evaluate that you were courteous and friendly in your conversation, culturally appropriate with the other person. Remember that in many languages there is a distinction between formal and informal forms of address. So when you're talking to somebody in French, you will say vous to somebody that you don't know so well, and tu to somebody who is a friend or somebody younger than you. And those sorts of things are important when you're using a foreign language. You should realize also that people who see you speaking their language as a foreign language to you will be very forgiving. So if you make some mistakes and if you use the informal when you should have used the formal, or you do something that you would expect a native speaker to know better, that's okay. Don't sweat that too much. But be sure that you appear courteous. A little extra politeness in someone else's language is way better than being extra casual. Sometimes there's a temptation to speak a little bit informally or to act a little extra relaxed so that you appear to come across as more fluent in the language than you are. That usually doesn't work very well. You usually just you just speak badly, because what seems casual and relaxed in English messes up your speech and understanding in other languages. So don't try to fake comfort level in your foreign language. Clarity is better than cleverness. You should ask yourself if you noticed any new words, phrases, or language patterns that you need to master. What are they? Write them down. This is why it's really important to do your evaluation phase right away after your communication event. Make notes of things that you need to focus on for your future cycles and to improve your language skill. What would have been most helpful to you that you didn't know when you went into this communication event? And when you think back, wow, if I had have been able to do that, that conversation would have been easier. That's one of the things that you want to make notes on and make plans for in an upcoming force cycle. Ask yourself if there's a specific focus that seems to be an obvious next step. Is there one that interests you? Maybe you had so much fun ordering your movie tickets in Portuguese that you want to go out and order movie tickets in Hindi, or whatever. But something that interests you. If it's interesting to you, you'll follow through on it. You'll have the motivation to do it and to do the work that it takes to prepare for a force cycle. And so you want to do stuff that's interesting, stuff that's fun, stuff that's practical. I always say you should be working on things that you will use soon and things that you will use often. And generally speaking, that includes a lot of stuff that just interests you. If it doesn't interest you, I don't think you'll really do much work or stick with it very long. you should ask yourself in the evaluation stage of the force cycle if you learned anything new about the target language culture. So, for example, do they have certain rules about using eating utensils at the table, or the way that you handle your food, or talking with food in your mouth, or putting your feet up, taking your shoes off? These are important parts of entering the target language community. Fully taking on another language is not simply a matter of words and phrases and syntax and vocabulary. It's also entering into another culture. And to do this effectively, you have to be prepared to become a member of that other culture. You'll do far better that way. To simply have words and phrases and stand as an outsider, talking always as an outsider with the person, limits how far you'll go with the language. But if you say, I really want to be inside this target language community, I'll always look white, people will always recognize me as, from wherever I'm from, but I want to be welcomed as much as possible as an insider in the target language community. And that means recognizing target language cultural items and cultural practices. Ask yourself if you made any progress in your new language after a communication event, even if it was just a little bit. What you'll find is that things that you learn in unusual situations, or situations where your antennas go up and where you're really focused and really paying attention, that part of the language tends to internalize much more easily. So when you're talking with a native speaker and you use the language in that context, it's so much fun, and you're really paying attention, you're listening carefully, you're watching, you're speaking carefully. Just about everything that you hear in that context will probably stick. So notice that and enjoy it. And ask yourself what your next focus should be and how soon you can do your next cycle. Evaluate your pronunciation, especially in the first 6 months of your study. Some languages, I'm speaking as a native speaker of English, some languages are easier for us to pronounce than others. I find that English-speaking people can pronounce Spanish reasonably well in a very short amount of time. But for us to pronounce French reasonably well takes more effort. To pronounce Chinese is particularly difficult. The Chinese language grammatically is not so hard, but for us to pronounce tones correctly and some other little quirks of Chinese pronunciation, such as voiced and unvoiced consonants and aspirated versus unaspirated consonants. You might not even know what that means. But in some languages, we really have to pay attention to our pronunciation. And I would suggest, if you're learning a language with really different sounds from English, pay attention to your pronunciation and put a little work into it. Don't let yourself be completely bogged down by it so that you're afraid to speak just because you think you might have got a sound a little bit off. The point is, did you communicate real information at reasonable speed? You don't have to speak perfectly, and you probably never will speak with a perfect native-like accent. But could you be understood? And so pay attention to that, as I say, especially in the first 6 months. If there are people who can comment meaningfully on how well you pronounce the target language, invite their opinion. Ask them to comment on that. Ask them if your pronunciation is difficult to understand, fairly easy to understand most of the time, not a problem, or very good. I mean, that's 4 simple categories. If they don't pause, if they just talk with you as if they expect you to understand everything, that's a good sign. It's always nice to hear that you speak the target language easily, and they seem to do an exchange of information with you without pausing at all, or without adjusting their language too much to talk with you. You have to speak clearly enough to be understood. That's always the first measure. You have to be able to speak that well. And so being sloppy and extra casual and trying to speak in a way that sounds casual in English usually sounds just goofy in another language. Better to speak clearly and a little more carefully than you might in your own language. Gauge not only how well you are understood, but also how well you understood the other person and what they said. Did you understand the sounds that you heard? Did you understand the expressions that were used? Did you get the main idea? Did you get all the ideas? Did you get every detail? Or did you just sit there and stare for 10 minutes, repeating the word yes over and over again? That will help you evaluate your communication strategy. If you had a lousy communications event, don't worry about it. It just tells you that you have to adjust your cycles to be fitting to your proficiency level, or it will point out some things that you're just not really ready for yet, and just back it up a little bit. Um, Ask yourself if you caught the main idea of what was said to you, or if it was more than that. If there was a linguistic structure that confused you, as I said, investigate that structure right away. When you're using the language regularly, your mind happily welcomes the new structures that it needs in order to communicate. So if you are trying to learn structures that you're not using, or if you're trying to work through a book but you're not really using the language, it's so difficult to get those things inside of you. And what activates all of that information, if you've been taking a language course, or you studied in university, or you worked your way through a teach yourself kit or something, what really activates it and makes it work for you is when you use it in real life with native speakers. So you sit around and you mumble to yourself and you talk to yourself, you do that rehearse stage of the force cycle. That's all great. That's all actually really important. But what really brings it to life is your mind is just all fully engaged when you're communicating in real life with a native speaker. If you study the same structure with the same resources but without using it for real communication, it would be much harder to grasp and even harder for you to retain that information. So use it in real life communication, and all of this theoretical information that is might even feel a little bit difficult for you at times comes much more easily. Your brain is just ready for it. Your mind is alert, and it's saying, man, I really want to communicate something, and if this tool is going to let me do it, I'll take it on. And it's amazing how smart you are when you want to communicate and when you have that urge to engage in real life communication with another person. Write down your observations, not only about the problems that you encountered, but also about your successes. Wow, this went really well. I talked for 15 minutes, didn't use a word of English, and the other person didn't pause at all and didn't seem to have any difficulty talking with me. So that is the force cycle. Focus, organize, rehearse, communicate, and evaluate. As I said, I do this all the time. I prepare to go into a situation and use my target language to engage with the target language community and to improve my language skills. I'm sure that this will work for you. This has been a very short summary of the system. This is a much larger, more developed system than I've been showing you, but I have to keep the videos to a reasonably limited length, which I didn't really do because some of them were a half an hour long. But anyhow, that's as short as I can make it. I hope you enjoyed these, and I've got some more stuff coming. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.